Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs and Sunculp Africa Summit, I would like to welcome you to this interactive session on enabling policies and strategies for the accelerated growth of small and growing businesses. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. My name is Rosemary Amondi, and I'm the Regional Director for ANDI in East Africa. This morning, we're very privileged to have an incredible panel of policy shapers, technocrats, and practitioners in the ecosystem who are doing amazing work on the continent. We have with us today Florence Kimata, who is business reform specialist at the Ministry of East African Community and Regional Development in the Department of Business Reforms and Transformation, where she's seconded by the International Finance Corporation. She's part of a team that has led service delivery reforms across government ministries, departments, and agencies with the aim of providing a conducive, enabling environment for private sector, in particular SMEs. In her previous role, Florence was SME advisor to the Cabinet Secretary at the Ministry of Industry, Trade, Cooperatives, where she provided guidance and technical assistance in the design and implementation of SME development policy and financing solutions. She successfully structured and led private-public sector engagements with stakeholders within the entrepreneurship ecosystem. Florence was recently awarded a Head of State Commendation for exemplary contribution to public service. Welcome, Florence, and congratulations on that well-deserved Head of State Commendation.
Thank you, Rosemary. Happy to be here and be part of this discussion.
Thanks for joining us. Next, we have Bernard Chitunga, who is a Senior Officer, Partnerships, Donor Relations, and Special Projects at the African Development Bank Group, leading the Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa, also known as AFAWA. AFAWA is a key flagship project of the African Development Bank, whose mandate is to put a dent on the existing $42 billion access to finance gap for women-led and owned SMEs in Africa. Bernard leads partnerships on the $750 million AFAWA risk share mechanism, the $100 million Gender Equality Trust Fund, and the $61 million Women Entrepreneurs Finance Funds for the bank. The reason I highlight this fund is because they are the largest mobilized resources and efforts on the continent in unlocking private sector financing to women-led owned SMEs in Africa. Bernard and his team at the bank have an ambitious target, which is to unlock $5 billion over the next 5 years. And this effort started in 2020 and will be moving towards 2026. Bernard is joining us from Abidjan, where it's still quite early, and we greatly appreciate your sacrifice, Bernard. Welcome.
Thank you, Rosemary. It's a pleasure, and good morning, everybody.
Next, we have Sheena Raikundalia, who is the director of the UK-Kenya Tech Hub. Sheena has over 15 years experience in the legal, financial services, and impact investment sectors in Europe and East Africa, and over 7 years board experience. She's currently working with Digital, Cultural, Media and Sports Department with the British government in Kenya as the country director of the UK-Kenya Tech Hub. Before joining the UK-Kenya Tech Hub, she worked as a solicitor in London. She moved to Kenya and joined a leading impact investment group where she provided strategic advisory services to financial institutions, startups, corporations, development agencies, and NGOs across Africa. She's a qualified solicitor with a bachelor's degree in law from the University of Bristol and an MBA from Lord Ashcroft International Business School. Welcome, Sheena. Next, we have—
Thank you. Really great to be here.
Very welcome, Sheena. Next, we have Victor Otieno. Victor is an SME policy advocate, ecosystem strategist, author, thought leader, researcher, and consultant. He's deeply passionate about the African entrepreneur and has so far worked with over 500 organizations in over 5 African countries in East and Southern Africa. These include the Ministry of East African Community and Regional Development, Department of Business Reforms and Transformation, the UK Kenya Tech Hub, Digital Africa, AfriLabs, GIZ, I4Policy, amongst others. Victor has participated in SME policymaking processes and discussions across the continent, and more recently has been on the technical working group developing Kenya's startup bill. Victor holds an MBA in entrepreneurship and is currently the managing director of BIFA Consult. Welcome, Victor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Last, but definitely not the very least, we have Ronald Osumba, who is the regional director of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Ronald is a Tutu Fellow, Aspen Institute graduate, and Crans Montana Leader of Tomorrow with 16 years of experience in the private sector, public service, and entrepreneurship, having held various leadership positions in technology, ICT, telecommunications, media, banking, and finance. He previously served as the head of public sector at Oracle Corporation, Kenya, and a senior manager for government relations and public sector sales at Safaricom Limited. He was also chairman of the $50 million Youth Enterprise Development Fund in Kenya. For Kenyans in the audience, it is interesting to note that Ronald vied in 2013 as deputy president in Kenya alongside Peter Kenneth in the interest of justice and prosperity. And that's probably another session that we should have just to talk about that experience, Ronald, but feel very welcome, Ronald.
Thank you, Rosemary, and good morning to all.
So before we get into the conversation this morning, I'll first invite Victor to paint a picture for us on what the entrepreneurship policy landscape in Kenya looks like and take us through some of the challenges faced by small and growing businesses based on the research that his organization has done. And as is now Zoom culture and practice, please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Put your questions and contributions in the chat, and we will pick these up in the Q&A session at the end of our conversation. So welcome, Victor.
Thank you very much, Rosemary, and good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me and you can see my screen. Either you can nod or just say yes to allow me to proceed, as is the norm for Zoom nowadays. Yeah, so before we start, I just wanted us to just do a quick history in terms of policy making around small, medium enterprises in Kenya. And the word SME and the informal sector in Kenya was birthed in 1972 under an ILO report around employment income equity. This document, of course, characterized MSE or micro small enterprises or informal sector in terms of businesses that don't have formal structure, they're not licensed, ownership is within family, it's very labor intensive. Skills that are used within the business is through apprenticeship and not ideally through formal education system, and probably they operate in an unregulated market. So by then, this is around 1972, government focus was on what they were calling the modern sector. Modern sector was, multinationals as well as government parastatals. That was the major strategy in terms of supporting job creation, because it was assumed that these two major institutions or the modern economy, modern sector had the capability to be able to, employ more young people, as is the case currently. But the challenge then, as is now, is that the modern economy or the major private sector contribution towards job absorption was not as much. In 1972, we are looking at the modern sector employing around 20% of the total population vis-a-vis the informal sector. So, of course, government continued to pursue supporting modern sector, but of course there was a shift in terms of supporting the MSC sector, the micro small enterprise sector, through increased investment towards rural areas where a lot of small business were operating, and as well as trying to incorporate MSC into the modern sector value chain, as is the current practice currently, or the current strategy in terms of supporting businesses. So again, as was then, as is now, the agricultural sector continues to play a significant role in terms of GDP contribution. I think currently we are around 20% towards GDP. So as we came out of independence, there was a significant concentration in the agricultural sector, which consumed, of course, land. Of course, with growing population, there was the competition between land for agriculture as well as for population. Of course, then the government had to look for a strategy around economic development, which came through Session Paper number 1 of 1986, which was trying to shift the economy towards alternative sources of job creation and economic development. So SMEs became a strategy that government could use towards employing young people within the economy. As I've mentioned, 20% of jobs being created were within the modern sector, which was not enough, given that the number of graduates or the number of people who are joining the labor market. So of course, there was a shift in 1992 towards with a focus on MSME sector, which of course was by then and is now is still called the Jua Kali sector, because a lot of SMEs in Kenya are informal. Currently, I think is around 79% of the 7.4 million SMEs being within the being informal. So there was a shift in terms of supporting SMEs. Of course, this came in form of these three major areas: is exempting SMEs from import duties whenever they are importing capital machines, establishment of a district development fund, which of course the objective was to cascade funding within local areas, as well as have a district production center of sorts. So again, it's very similar to the current practice that current proposals that we have in terms of having some centers, support centers, either at the county or within sub counties. And we've seen the Ministry of Trade and Industry try to do something very similar. Of course, then there was the establishment of Rural Enterprise Fund to finance Jua Kali within the district level, as well as the issue of developing workspaces for the sector. So in terms of MSC, I think it's, as we go towards this discussion, we probably need to be able to define in the Kenyan context, because again, when we hear the word MSME or SMEs, depending with the jurisdiction, that definition can change. So in Kenya currently, SMEs are governed under the MSME Act 2012, where it has defined who SMEs are, and the major agency that is supporting SMEs based on this definition is the Micro Small Enterprise Authority under the Ministry of Industry and Trade. And of course, SMEs are defined based on characteristics around turnover, number of employees. So we have micro businesses that have turnovers of less than 1 million Kenya shillings. Small enterprises have between 1 million and 5 million shillings. Of course, there are parameters around number of employees. So when we talk about MSMEs, we are ideally looking at this kind of definition. So why do we talk about SMEs and why are they important? Based on the various reports that we've seen, is SMEs, of course, are majority in terms of numbers. So currently they are around 98% of all registered business in Kenya. If you're to compare that with the output of the sector, of course, is a debate that is still out there. So SMEs support or employ over 40% of the population. If you look at link with major manufacturers or major value chains, SMEs offer support, especially to in last mile delivery services to major manufacturing entities. So of course, SMEs are critical to the economy since independence, even up to date. We are still trying to grapple with how can we be able to support SMEs to ensure that they're able to contribute towards socioeconomic development in the country. So, of course, SMEs are defined in the national strategy under Vision 2030, and of course, they have been isolated in terms of getting special support, and that has continued to take place between MTP1 up to MTP3, where we have the Big Four agenda. So the diagram I put there was for our own thoughts and thinking, especially when we talk about the MSME ecosystem. Usually whenever the word SME ecosystem comes, we hear the first thing that comes to mind usually is maybe triple helix or quadruple helix or quintuple helix, where you're looking at academia, industry, as well as government. But for us to be able to support SMEs, we probably need to understand the ecosystem from their own lenses. And it's based on this that we're able to draw the challenges and probably draw a possible solution or policy or legal interventions. So we have, your human capital, you have your finance, you have your markets, and you have your business support. So the triple helix or the quadruple helix, whichever way you want to look at it, falls within this MSC ecosystem. So, once we understand a bit of history, of course, I've been able to, I've compressed that story significantly. And it gives us context for us to go towards the challenges that SMEs face. So the last report, of course, we have is Kenya National Bureau of Statistics data report MSME 2016, which highlighted some of the challenges that SMEs face. So of course, number one is issues around financing, access to market in terms of customers, shortage of raw materials, which speaks to working capital, too many competitors, etc., etc. So these are some of the challenges that lead towards the closure of businesses. So we know that SMEs currently, of course, this rate might have changed, face a mortality of 79% within the first 3 years of business. That basically means that 3 out of 5 businesses close within the first 3 years of starting their business. So of course, these challenges, this cocktail of challenges contribute towards that. Other than business closing down, we have challenges that relate towards impeding significant growth of SMEs. And what you'll notice, of course, there is always the issue around financing, but there is a commonality between the reasons that lead to closure and reasons that that leads towards curtailing of significant growth. For the purposes of this discussion, of course, we might not be able to address all the issues that that have been raised, but I'll just focus on 2. One is around licenses and the legal environment. Of course, Florence and Sheena, I'm sure you have comments around the same. Then I'll look at probably just access to finance. So in terms of the compliance or the regulatory environment, the way I structured it is just to look at some of the issues that have been raised by small businesses around compliance or the regulatory environment. We have issues around the cost of compliance being too high, and probably this may have a correlation with informality within in the country. So if you look at the cost of compliance for a small business, the cost benefit might be to the contrary. Of course, through the Ministry of ESC, there has been significant steps towards addressing that. Maybe Florence can touch on that. There is the issue of multiple licensing. Again, there are a barrage of licenses that, depending on the sector, that you need to comply with, which makes it very complicated for SMEs. There are issues around registration requirements. Again, I do recognize, or we do recognize, that the business climate and the Ministry of EAC through the Department of Transformation and Reforms has been able to do a lot of work around this, but there is still more that needs to be done, especially for some of the sectors around agriculture, export, import, etc. There are challenges around county governments in terms of course issues around cess, having unpredictable tax regime or tax policy at the counties. And of course, there is the general perception of the regulator or government being revenue driven as opposed to developing a conducive environment. So in terms of the second challenge, and I said I'll just focus on two, is around access to finance. Of course, this is a major issue with a lot of stakeholders playing this, trying to put interventions toward this. And the way I wanted to put it is just to put it in terms of what we've seen is the practice and what is currently happening within the financial access ecosystem. So based on Africa Development Bank, and of course this can be confirmed, is financing gap is around 19 billion in Africa. And of course the major challenge is the product market fit of financial services, as well as the business model not being able to fit in the MSME space. And of course this is driven by the informality of businesses vis-a-vis the collateral-based lending model of financial institutions. So just looking at two funds, the affirmative action funds, in terms of disbursement of loans, we have a combined 3.5 billion per annum being disbursed between the three affirmative action funds. So if you are to compare this with the 500 billion that is being disbursed through M-Pesa, it tells you that there is a role for technology to be able to open the area around financial access of SMEs. So we've seen a major play in terms of course M-Pesa, as well as different fintechs that are currently in the country playing a major role in terms of financial access. You can see Fuliza, for example, disbursing 1.3 billion per day to 1.7 million customers. So it means that there is a role there is a nexus that we need to find in terms of how do we allow technology to be able to play a role in terms of interacting with traditional financing institution, as well as the models that they adopt. So in terms of just recommendations around finance, of course, this is subject to debate, is looking at the current affirmative actions that we have, because whenever we are talking about policy, we would stick to government-led intervention. So we already have the affirmative action funds that are currently there. Of course, the performance, if you look at the disbursement vis-a-vis the potential of these funds, there is a role that technology, especially, for example, Digital Lender Association of Kenya, that has been able to figure a lending risk model analysis that probably can be used, that can allow maybe some of these affirmative action funds to be able to borrow a leaf and try to raise financial inclusion of MSMEs. There is, of course, the aggregation of value proposition of the credit guarantee scheme together with the Movable Property Securities Act. So what we've seen is the credit guarantee scheme is a game changer and is a precursor to the affirmative action funds. So the uptake of the credit guarantee scheme within the 7 banks that have initially been in the pilot phase has not been as optimal. So maybe just combining the value proposition of the credit guarantee scheme, Movable Property Securities Act, of course, together with aggressive marketing, etc., can be able to help us be able to allow SMEs to be able to access more finance. Of course, lastly is the inclusion of Digital Lender Association, which is the association that brings together the different players within the fintech space, giving them more say in terms of shaping the credit guarantee scheme or any other financial inclusion intervention that government is engaged in. So again, we've seen laws, the central bank set up a framework or legal framework to be able to govern this particular sector. And I feel there is an opportunity for us to be able to really address the issue around MSME access to finance. I would stop there. Just, of course, this was just a curtain raiser to the eminent panel or members to just be able to take it up from there. Thank you very much, Paul, Rosemary.
Thank you so much, Victor, for that. And I think you've done an excellent job setting for us the backdrop. And that will be the basis upon which we will then move to have a conversation on this topic. So you've presented some history there in terms of policy interventions, even defining the context within which we talk about small and growing businesses. With regard to various growth stages, and then highlighted specifically some of the challenges that small and growing businesses face. And I think one thing stuck with me, and we always talk about, so many number of businesses fail in the first so many number, but you talked about a mortality rate of 79% within the first 3 years. You talked about the issues that we've been grappling with for a while now, but I think you've also done a good job in terms of just putting some numbers and putting some context to these challenges, which include access to working capital, market access, and the mismatch, the product market fit in terms of financial products. So I'll start with you, Florence, as someone who is at the center of business reforms aimed at transforming public sector service delivery. What informs your business reforms approach working in the Department of Business Reforms and Transformation? And what is government doing to address some of the challenges that Victor has highlighted?
All right, thank you, Rosemary. So, for the sake of context setting, the Business Reforms and Transformation Department was established within the Ministry of EAC, really to address the agenda of how to improve Kenya's competitiveness by looking at, the business environment, working with private sector to systematically address the issues that affect the development of private sector. So this is work that was previously undertaken through the Ministry of Industry, but now hosted by the Ministry of EAC. So what the department does and how they address the challenges, it's not prescriptive, so it's very consultative. So what we do is that we engage private sector and sort of get the pressing issues with regard to, one, engaging with government, as well as just general business climate issues. And we do an annual action plan on how to address some of these issues. And this is a long-term plan. And of course, this was an agenda that was previously linked with the Doing Business agenda on the World Bank Index, which is no longer there. But what the government did was to institutionalize the reform agenda, because this is good for the country. I mean, it's not only for ranking, but it's good for the country. It's something that continuously needs to be addressed, even as we deliver public service. So how the approach is that we look at the life cycle of a business. Right from the registration of a business up till, the scaling of a business and whatever form of exit the business, moves to. So a lot of the reforms are based on, one, digitizing government service delivery. Number two, looking at the legal and regulatory framework and how conducive it is to support the growth of these small and growing businesses. And then again, we look at administrative reform. So sort of threefold in terms of the approach that we use. So, and I'll give you some examples. So at the point of registering a business, typically you submit your registration documents through the business registration service. The next stage was to then submit similar documents to the Kenya Revenue Authority. If you're an employer, you would then submit the same set of documents to the National Hospital Insurance Fund, as well as to the National Social Security Fund. So what we have done is to rationalize that whole system. You realize all these 4 agencies are agencies of government. All this information which is being requested does reside with government. So what we did is to then do a back-end integration of these agencies so that you only submit one set of documents. You submit your application through the business registration services. Information is shared on the back end, and at the end of the day, you will get a certificate of incorporation, your PIN, your tax registration, your personal identification number, as well as an NSSF and NHIF registration if you're an employer. So what this does is really reduce the time taken for you to engage with government agencies, as well as reduce the cost of actually getting this service from government. This, of course, has involved a lot of resources in terms of enhancing the systems for upgrade, but it is for for support to private sector and in terms of building efficiencies. This is what we call the integrated, the unified business registration system. So once you're facilitated through registration, we then look at what other services would you engage government for. Application of utilities. So if I then want to apply for electricity or water connection, and I go to Kenya Power, what is my expectation? That I will be able to have a seamless, e-registration. That is also something that we have worked on. We've also been looking at issues of, the reliability of supply. How do we make sure there are few outages, as possible? How do we make sure that once there's an outage, it's resolved within the minimum time possible? So looking at all those statistics and trying to benchmark with, the best practices, global best practices, and seeing how we can improve the utility and what the utility provision to best have the industry. Of course, there are issues of, maintenance of the infrastructure, which are greater issues that have been addressed. But in terms of the delivery of the service, I think it's something that we're keen to look at. On the application for water and sewer, for example, and we start with, because this is a decentralized service, we started with Nairobi County. And we went and in 2020, automated the process of water and sewer. So with just 2 steps, you just get onto the portal of Nairobi Water and you apply for your water and sewer, unlike before when you had to go and look for a Nairobi Water office for you to apply for your water. The other thing we did is to put information upfront so that you don't need to keep calling to find out how much does it cost me? How do I need to lay my pipes? What's the quality of the material that I need? All that is online. And similarly, the payment is done online, and you only get a visit for inspection and connection from the Nairobi Water staff. So looking at those kind of services, again, access to credit, and this is something that Victor has mentioned in terms of the challenges of financing. How do we facilitate access to credit? Looking at the smaller businesses which are not able to have the collateral that is typically requested for by banks. How do we then look for other innovative ways of, having collateral that is accepted by banks? So the movable assets registry. Am I able to use my stocks, for example, as a form of security? And what is the framework for registering such security? So we started the movable assets registry for banks to be able to use that as collateral and also share the collateral, because then it's accessible by all banks. And if I take a share of that collateral and the value of the collateral is still high, another bank can still use it as collateral. So improving access to financing. Other areas, for example, access to justice. So we realized that, commercial cases were part of the cases which form the backlog in the judiciary system. So when we look at commercial courts, how do we then enable this, contractual disputes? How do we accelerate the resolution of commercial disputes? So we separated cases of a value of below 1 million, and we formed the small claims court within the Kilimani commercial courts. And what those courts do, first of all, they eliminated filing fees. So you do not need to pay filing fees if the value of your case is below 1 million. Secondly, they allow for e-filing of the documentation, for the case. Rulings are also made and delivered, can be delivered online. Again, you're given the option of the alternative dispute resolution, so you don't have to go through the whole court case, but there are other ways of resolving this court case. A limit to the resolution of cases was put at a maximum of 60 days. So again, facilitating any contractual disputes, because you'll find that even for a startup who gets into contractual arrangements, some of those things, some of the agreements may go wrong, but how do you resolve them without affecting your business? Then issues of, for example, resolving insolvency. We saw during COVID a number of companies that, became insolvent. How do we make sure that we are not, just because a business has been declared insolvent, our intention is to revive that business. So how do we enable the business to continue as a going concern and to make sure that, it's facilitated to recover as opposed to, the business winding down? How do you make sure that even the minority shareholders are part of the decision making, when the decisions are being made with regard to the company? So just having that whole legal framework reviewed. We have also been reviewing a number of laws and regulations that affect businesses and publishing what we call the Business Amendment Clause since 2020. And what that does is to, for example, look at any regulation that slows down delivery of service to private sector and be able to refine that. If because of automating a service, we substantially reduce the time taken to deliver a service, and in law it has been defined to take longer, we amend that law. For example, in the Public Procurement and Disposal Act, we had the days it takes to bid and get contracted for a government service. Because of automation, those days have substantially reduced. So you will find that even the time taken to evaluate bids, time taken to contract have been reduced substantially because automation has, this process has been largely automated. So just reviewing and making sure that our laws and regulations do aptly support the businesses. We have also been trying to put out a lot of information that, because sometimes information empowers these small businesses. How do we put up information on compliance information in a palatable way, in a very simple way? Again, the regulatory toolkit is one of the examples that we have. Because it's not easy to find all these laws and regulations in one place. You really have to know where to find them and be able to read them and find how you are supposed to comply. A lot of people discover what they're supposed to comply with when an enforcement officer visits their business. But to be able to find a one-stop portal where you can find guidance on how you comply right from the onset across different sectors, you will find it in a website called the www.doingbusinesskenya.com. And in there, we try and break down the framework of how you comply at the national level and even to the county level. But I'm sure my colleague Sheena will be able to delve more into that. But yes, the government is very keen on looking at the enabling environment. A lot of what Victor described is on the enterprise development side. What are the gains that have been done? What are we supporting these businesses? But again, we can have strong businesses. We can establish strong businesses. But if we are not building the right environment for these businesses to thrive, it will be a challenge for these businesses. So I'm happy to be able to be working on the flip side, having worked previously on enterprise development, now looking at enabling environment, and I must tell you, it's very gratifying because you do change. Changing a law means that, it's something that will live beyond you, Putting in place a system, an automated system to deliver a service, again, it's something that outlives you. So what we are really focusing on is making sure that we deliver the services at the least time possible to deliver the service at the least cost and very efficiently. Of course, administrative reforms and mindset shifts are things that we work on over a period of time. But yeah, the goodwill is there. The government is very supportive and we are making progress. So there's a lot that the government is doing. And again, you will find a milestone report, published, under our the same domain name in our ministry department, showcasing the work that has gone over the last 6 years in terms of the reforms, because not many people know it, but we really want to start a publicity campaign so that people can appreciate different policies that have been put in place by government to support the work they're doing. Thank you, Rosemary. I think I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Florence, for that elaborate outline in terms of what you're doing. And I guess, as you rightly said, coming from previously the enterprise side, and now sitting right in the middle of business reforms. So I'm hearing several different things. So unified, business service delivery. I'm hearing a raft of measures aimed both at speaking to the regulatory framework, ease of doing business. I'm hearing leveraging technology in terms of reducing costs, reducing the burden, the compliance burden. So this is all very, very, very good. I think part of the challenge, and this is where I would now like Sheena to come in, is that we sometimes hear of these things depending on which forum you are in. And the other day we were also having a conversation about how these conversations are also very siloed. In many different forums where we've sat, we kind of get surprised every time we hear what government is doing. So there's this idea of information asymmetry, not just in terms of the services and the support that is available to entrepreneurs, but also particularly how to navigate the regulatory environment. So I think this is where I'd like you to come in, Sheena, and kind of maybe just talk about what this partnership between FCDO and the government of Kenya through the UK Kenya Tech Hub to address this information gaps, or what we call information asymmetry, in particular navigating the regulatory regime. What has been your experiences there, and what are some of the challenges that you're facing? But also, I think what would be interesting is just this partnership. What underpins this partnership? Is this something that can be replicated? Is this something that we can more or less learn from? So Sheena, welcome.
Thank you. And yeah, great question. I think just before I move on to the regulatory work and the regulatory partnerships, just an overview. I think one of the things that I've learned now in my role working with the UK government is actually, in order to really, really scale and help the entrepreneurial ecosystem grow, there needs to be some partnership with government. I know sometimes private sector just thinks, oh God, partnering with government is difficult and can be difficult, and government is slow and bureaucratic. And honestly, you are right. And actually, and it's for a reason, and some might be valid and some might not be valid. And we hear a lot of conversations towards moving to agile governance, formed by data, where you can make quick decisions and create an enabling policy environment. And I think Florence and her team are trying to do that and have made a lot of progress in that. I would advise everyone to look at the report that summarizes the changes that they have been made, because I think a lot of good things have happened, but when I speak to businesses, they're not aware of it. So for example, the commercial courts, etc., that Florence was talking about. So I think one is sometimes a lot of good things are happening within government and across, but some just don't hear about it. And it's actually very difficult because everybody kind of works in silos and there's not so much linkages. And I think that linkages point is very important. I think that's where the roles of forums like Sankalp or Andy, for example, come into play, which is how can we do this and build better linkages between government and the private sector, and whether that's international governments, the local governments and the private sector, I think academia, etc. It's really, really important. So I think that's the first point in order to create an enabling policy environment, is the communication of what's already been done. But before communicating, it's how do you come up with the right policies? You see, at the moment, we potentially all have our own echo chambers, right? We we speak to the same people and we might not understand what's going on from a policy perspective. So it's also very interesting. It's also very, very important to have to have different people together. So whether it's a policy lab, a hackathon, bring in a techie, bring in a painter, bring in a business, bring in a lawyer, bring in government together. And I think that's how you create some really good policy, understand the enabling environment. So what's been my experience? And at the moment, as the UK Kenya Tech Hub and the UK government, we've worked very closely with the Kenyan government. So of course, we worked with Florence's team on the regulatory toolkit, and actually Victor's the implementing partner. So you've got all of us here, but also other things. So for example, we worked very closely with the Ministry of ICT, where we launched a COVID hackathon. And in fact, soon you'll see on social media some of the progress that's been made through the hackathon. It wasn't just a hackathon, but because of the government's support, one of the companies actually, got the regulations and manufactured their own drone here in Kenya, and has signed a commercial deal with another government agency. So there's a lot that can happen when government partners properly with private sector and startups. Same thing with the White Box Initiative. We partnered with the Ministry of ICT on this. We're working on another program, which is a digital apprenticeship program, where we're placing young people into jobs. So what we're saying is internships is very, very, everyone talks about internships. We're talking about apprentices, where the business comes to us and tells us, this is my problem. I need a website. I need a digital marketing campaign. I need a chatbot. And we link them through our program partners, Eldo Hub and Thunderbird. We link them to amazing talent in Kenya to complete the project. You won't believe, in the two cohorts, 90% of those young people have got jobs. And these are new jobs that SMEs and startups have created. And the businesses themselves have said, oh my God, I can't believe this talent exists in Kenya. Now, this is a great initiative, but so far we've only touched a little, like just a small percentage. So we are going to partner with government, the Ministry of ICT, the JIRA platform, and things that are available to scale so that everybody available can hear about it. So that's why partnerships with government are very, very important for that purpose of scale. Now, moving on to what you touched on, the regulatory environment and enabling policies for business. It's difficult, hate it or love policies. And I'm an ex-lawyer. The regulation and taxes are going to haunt you. Even after you die, it's going to haunt you. So as a business, and especially as a business that wants to grow, you have to figure out a way to deal with it. Having said that, lawyers and governments and policymakers, we don't make it easy. Like when I look at all the policies, and I'm a lawyer, I look at them, I think, oh my God, how is a business going to be able to deal with this, right? I mean, they already have their own challenges. They're having to run their business. They want to make money. They want to pay their people. Like they don't have time to do this. And actually, then they get worried that if we don't do this, we're going to get harassed either way. So what can we do to make life easy? Contrary to popular belief, government wants businesses to succeed, because if businesses succeed, you get more jobs, they get more taxes, which can then be used to develop, the ecosystem further. So businesses do want government to succeed, so I think the question then becomes, the intention is there, and how do you do this? And this is where our regulatory toolkit came in to address one of the problems. We realize whether you're planning a business, starting a business, managing a business, or scaling your business, there's hordes of regulations. There's almost 200 regulators in Kenya. So whether you're in the finance state, the agriculture industry, the medical and health industry. So what do you do? So what we did is we got all that legislation together, and Victor and his team did an amazing job on this, and put it together in the regulatory toolkit, and I can share a link on the website, or maybe with Victor, you can share a link on the chat box so people can on the chat so that people can see it. And basically what we did is, if you're a business and you want to know how to start a business or how to scale your business, we've put everything together in a very easy toolkit with animated videos and, where you can just work through it and what you need instead of going through everything. We just completed phase 2, which was launched with 10 counties, and eventually we're hoping to get it across all the counties. But now it's gone to that level where we even have a calculator. So for example, if you want to calculate the cost of setting up a hotel in Mombasa versus Nakuru versus Eldoret, you can do it. It can tell you how much it costs. It can tell you how long it will take. It can tell you who the person is that you need to talk to if it's not integrated already digitally. So a lot of change has been made. But again, the first toolkit that we launched last March had 1.5 million hits, which was amazing. This toolkit has now been launched. What we need to do is we need to get people to know about this and they can start using it. Like one of my best moments has been, I've been on a WhatsApp group and somebody's been complaining about regulation, like, oh, I don't know what to do. And somebody else has shared the regulatory toolkit. Now that's a huge win. And that's what we need to see, because this is something that was delivered in partnership with government and us, the UK government and the private sector, the Kenya National Chamber of Commerce, KEPSA, business associations, startup associations like ASEC and Countrywide, etc., and delivered for entrepreneurs. And it's now going to work if more people know about it and use it. So I think that's the bit that I would want to say: communication, linkages, and also, people being more involved right from the start. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sheena. And I kind of like that you really hit it spot on. Partnerships. When you're talking about this idea that we only think about government as that organ that looks down upon and kind of reads, this is what you're going to do from today. And then gone are the days when as one of my colleagues say, we used to work our figures at government and tell them, oh, this is not working, this is not working, and kind of that shift towards public-private engagement and partnerships. And I think the work that you're doing with the UK Tech Hub and working across the different ecosystem players, particularly government at the center, is really an excellent example. And I'll really come back to that later when we're talking about what more needs to be done and how can we improve this kind of engagements and be able to replicate what you're doing. So I'd now like to take a little bit of a shift and move to Bernard. So Bernard, development finance institutions have been trying to address the finance gap through, for example, this on-lending facilities to financial institutions. So, we've seen a mixed bag in terms of what's been happening with regard to those facilities, how they're structured, and even sometimes the results, one of which we often hear, well, there's this fund, there's some affirmative action fund that's now started. But when you talk to entrepreneurs, they're still saying, well, that fund was announced, but it's not really trickling down to us. So what are you, from where you sit at the African Development Bank, what have been some of the challenges around this kind of on-lending facilities, and what is the bank doing in this regard? And I'd also like you to tell us more about about AFAWA, and in particular address the question, why women?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Rosemary. Especially the last question, why women? It's a very interesting one. All of us here, we are 49 of us. We were born of a woman, right? And that woman took care of us until we were able to take care of ourselves. So is it just godly and morally right for now us to take care of those women? And that is what smart people do. That's what smart economists do. The number of women, the percentage of women. When you go to any market, before you meet one man, you will have met 4 women who are trading. When you go to a cross-border and there are these traders moving, goods from one country to the other, before you meet one man, you will have met 7 women, right? And so it's important that when we are doing investments in SMEs in our economies, we are deliberate in investing for women. And that is why the Africa Development Bank, of course, established the Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa. Of course, this is as a result of all what's happening in countries, international pledges. But the Africa Development Bank, as a multilateral on the continent, looked at it and saw many actors out there on the continent, many governments, but in as much as everybody is doing impeccable work, it's a bit siloed and uncoordinated. And so the interventions end up being in silos and they are not targeted. And so our approach on the establishment of affirmative finance action for Africa is threefold. So how can all of us as actors be convened to address the problem of finance? At the same time, address the problem of capacity, and at the same time, address the issue of enabling environment, so that we do not have actors, saying, here is a fund, here is money. And so there is a fund, but I do not have the capacity to come and take that money and appropriate it and invest it in my business. But also, I have the capacity, then there is the money, but the environment for me to do business is started. And so with that, that threefold sort of challenges, we said, okay, we have financial institutions out there in countries. We have private funds out there. We have SACCOs out there. We have microfinance institutions out there. Then how can we, using the convening power of the Africa Development Bank on the continent, through the instruments that we have, get some sort of concessional facilities, concessional monies, whether they are lines of credit or private equity investments, or they are trade finance that these SMEs can be able to access. Right, and so as we push that money, of course, talking to the rest of the world, who bring in the money, and of course, some of the monies that come from our governments and come from our pensions, and bringing all that money together. How can we socialize, support, and improve the capacity of those financial institutions to be able to speak to SMEs? And from where I see it as AFAWA, to speak to women SMEs, right? So that I can look at KCB in Kenya, I can look at ABSA wherever, I can look at Standard Bank, EcoBank, and it can identify itself, and the respective SMEs or the women SMEs can be able, and that requires a lot of capacity, and it requires a lot of advisory, a lot of technical assistance. And so for us, as the bank and as AFAWA, as we are putting in a line of credit, a concessional facility, we are also putting in a grant to help ABSA, to help Equity, to be able to have a women financing arm, to have an SME financing arm, to be able to have a policy that speaks to that. And then, of course, working with central banks to ensure accountability. And for us, as AFAWA, Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa, working with all central banks across all our 54 countries so that they hold the financial institutions to account in terms of the reporting. They are saying, these are the number of women SMEs we have financed this quarter, this half year, and all that. And then, of course, on the collateral part of it, because we know most of our SMEs, women SMEs are not able to afford that. In terms of collateral, we have put together a guarantee scheme that covers women SMEs up to 75%. And so for us, it's just to incentivize the financial ecosystem in our African countries to be able to on-lend to the women. And so to close it up, AFAWA, under the bank, we support on lines of credit, on monies. Then we have trust funds that appropriate grants. And on these grants, there are two things that we are doing to support SMEs, especially on enabling environment. We put some grants out there to support enablers. These are accelerators, women business associations, and all the entities, cooperatives, right? We give small grants of just up to $250,000 so that this forms a bigger ecosystem that will feed into the banks. And then we have another sort of grants that we support those entities that are supporting women in the informal economy. There are many SMEs that are in the informal economy. So any entity that is working, whether it's an NGO, whether it's a development institution, whether it's whatever, supporting these SMEs to move from the informal economy to the formal economy. So for us, we're more of a convening power to ensure that all our actors are working on a coordinated and to ensure interventions are targeted. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernard. And I think as you were speaking, one of the things that stood out to me is, kind of when you were talking about, your approach. So thinking about it more from a systematic, point of view, so that if you solve for access to finance, but the environment within which you're operating doesn't work, then it really doesn't solve the problem. So I like this idea of looking at this multi-pronged approach and taking an ecosystem view of the problem. So I think in terms of what you've just laid out, the one thing I also picked up in terms of what you're doing with AFAWA is this whole idea of holding financial institutions to account, which I think is something that we would be interested in speaking to you more in the long run and understanding whether that actually has an impact and whether it's addressing some of the challenges that we've seen in the past in terms of this funds actually trickling down to the intended target. So obviously this is a conversation that we'll keep coming back to. So I'll move on just a little bit because we'll still come back and have more or less one last piece of this conversation. But before we do that, I'd like to now invite Ronald. And Ronald, you have a very interesting background, having chaired the Youth Enterprise Fund and now with the Tony Blair Institute. So I'd just like you to come in and give us some perspective here based on what you're hearing, both from, the business reforms perspective, the conversations around partnerships, the conversations around, the role of development financial institutions, picking up on where Bernard left off, and give us some perspective in terms of the work that you're doing with the Institute. And you, as an organization, I think how you kind of phrased your work with governments is providing strategic advice and practical support to political leaders. So what does this mean? What is working? What can we learn from your experiences in engaging governments and political leaders?
Thank you, Rosemary, and thank you, everybody else who's just spoken before me. I think very critical conversation that we are having here, particularly on the continent of Africa, where every government is now focused on ensuring that this youth bulge that the continent is experiencing is converted into dividend, and therefore trying to create new pathways in entrepreneurship for young people. And people have spoken about the challenges that governments and political leaders are facing, whether those be systemic in the business environment, policy and regulatory environment, financial sector, which includes really, when you look at it across the value chain of finance, it's not just issues of lending, but there's taxation, for example, and making the tax regime easier for entrepreneurs, small businesses and startups to succeed. So, maybe let me just take a step back and try and introduce the Tony Blair Institute. Obviously, Tony Blair, Prime Minister, now Sir Tony, is the founder of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, and essentially established the institute out of his own experience as a political leader trying to deliver a mandate that he had been given by people, and realizing that there is actually a science to delivering on the promises that you make to people. And this science is what is called deliverology. And, you know, I mean, we won't get into that today, but ideally it's a, you know, 4-step process, if you like, that leads us to deliver on a lot of these promises that we make. We look at, you know, how do you manage projects? How do you manage and track performance using delivery units? So essentially this is what we do. We work shoulder to shoulder with political leaders, helping them to prioritize a small number of delivery outcomes, helping them with policy reform to complement and reinforce those priorities, helping them to plan so that you can be able to translate priorities to near-term resourced actions. And then obviously, finally, if you don't track performance, you cannot deliver. So helping them deliver performance platforms that help them deliver on these promises. Now, obviously, I mean, I have had the privilege of being on almost every side of this discussion. So, you know, I have worked in the private sector, working very closely with government. I have been an entrepreneur myself. You know, I have been in government at the Youth Fund trying to support small businesses across Kenya, at least. I have worked with the NEFCDO program, and Sheena will know this, called the Kenya Catalytic Jobs Fund, which again is, you know, looking at how do you test innovative ideas that can create jobs and opportunities for young people. Now I am in the policy making space, working with government to support this bold, pragmatic, progressive reforms. There's a lot of work that is happening in the East Africa region, you know, whether you're looking at Rwanda with their Made in Rwanda initiative, just trying to protect and build locally made and resourced Rwanda products. In Ethiopia, where you have the Ethiopia Investments Holdings, looking at their national assets and their national resources and how to build the capacity of local entrepreneurs to be globally competitive. In Kenya, obviously, Florence has already spoken about a lot of the things that Kenya is doing, wanting to be a financial center that attracts investments to support local businesses, not just in Kenya, but in the region as well. I will obviously have a bias, as you may all know, I will have a bias for tech, right? So, you know, not only because I've spent 14 years of my life now working with tech and tech startups, but also because it is really, I think, the space that has potential to unlock not just tech businesses, but all other businesses when we're talking about building a digital economy, right? And the Tony Blair Institute now is also working with governments to see how to leverage technology to drive delivery, even as we look at policy reforms. And recently, our tech and public policy team has just produced a report on how to accelerate tech growth on the continent, and tech, and particularly tech enterprises and tech startups. And essentially, our report is talking about having bold and decisive policy measures around 3 things, most of which have already been covered by the speakers before, and therefore I will not spend too much time in it. The first is, how do you build a business environment that supports startups, and particularly tech startups? We obviously all know the cost of doing business is high. Markets remain inaccessible for a lot of tech startups. There are, again, a lot of people have already spoken about this, legacy regulatory challenges that needs to be fixed through having regular, regulatory conversations. People like Florence and Sheena are, of course, driving this kind of conversations. There's inadequate digital infrastructure that allows, for us to take advantage, for example, of the free trade area. So how do we build seamless online activities that promote fair competition, data protection and all these other things that we talk about? Everyone is talking about the skills gap. So even as we are trying to build our small businesses, there's still huge skills gap. And how then do we support them to upskill, reskill, and all these other new ideas that need to drive their businesses forward? So that's the first thing. I think there needs to be a serious conversation. We are here to support this kind of conversations. Again, like Bernard said, we also have the convening power because we work at the center of government, mostly at the president and prime minister level, and therefore have access to drive some of these discussions. The second thing is we think there should be an effort to close the funding gap. Bernard will challenge this. I know, FDP is talking about a 19 billion step up so that we can reach, a pool of funding of about 19 billion. We think we can get to 90 billion by 2030 by building an investment landscape that encourages rather than deters investors. I'm extremely impressed with the work that is happening now in Kigali, for example, as they try to set up the Kigali Investments Financial Center. President Kagame is extremely focused on making Kigali a hub and domiciliation of investors in Kigali for the region. But we can only be able to do this if, the risk that you talked about earlier, Rosemary, and I think Sheena responded to, is the information asymmetry. How do we make reliable information about SMEs and the products that we produce and the services that we give more reliable? That information needs to be reliable by reducing these asymmetries. How do we unleash capital, institutional capital, to be accessible to SMEs, right? How do we develop innovative financial vehicles? In Ethiopia now, Prime Minister Abiy is thinking about setting up the Sovereign Investments Fund. This is, of course, tricky conversation. We're supporting through the policy thinking around that. It has barely worked anywhere on the continent of Africa. It has worked in other places, but we do think for us to be able to step up to this 90 billion benchmark for Africa, we need to be having this kind of conversations. Finally, I think we need to be able to build networks that connect and enable knowledge sharing. Again, as entrepreneurs, you will know that we are quite vicious on each other, really, and we need to be building platforms that support collaboration. Developing, if you like, national, regional, and even continental and global associations of hubs. Sheena and her team have done an extremely fantastic job in bringing, the hubs in Kenya into one association. It's a conversation that is now beginning in Kigali as well. And we then need to go over and beyond and say, how do we have a Pan-African network that supports these businesses? I will stop there in recognition of time, because as you know, Rosemary, I can keep going on and on about this subject. Thank you.
Yes, Ronald, and like I said, this is just the beginning. And you said it very well when you said these are the kinds of conversations that we need to continue having. So I was as one of the things that resonated with me is some of the words that you were using, pragmatic, practical. Because, when we tend to talk about policy, it's about the challenges, it's about the bottlenecks, it's about, all these things, but we never get to a point where we're saying things are not moving not because of the lack of willingness, but maybe there's just a problem around the delivery. How do you actually, think about, delivering what is stuck, where is stuck? How do you know that it is moving? So tracking. So you're talking about project management and speaking to the leadership around practical things that we've always talked about and done in the private sector, and kind of bringing that, because this language is not language that you hear in tracking performance and monitoring. That is not language we hear when we engage with political leaders. So very, very interesting to hear that. And now it makes sense when you talk about, what is practical support, when you talk about, working with political leaders. And I am very surprised. Well, I learn things every day, but there's a science to delivery. There's a science to delivering promises. So we would want to read and hear more about that, obviously in subsequent conversation. But thank you so much, Ronald, for that. So I will now move to the last portion of this conversation, where I will invite each of our panelists to kind of just go around and share a thought. I can see your questions have been coming in, and Florence and Victor have been doing an excellent job at addressing some of them. I would encourage the panelists also to look at the chat box and also continue to address them as they come in. And then once we finish this round of responses, I know Bernard will want to respond to Ronald's challenge. And earlier I said that the AFDB, Bernard and his team have set themselves out an ambitious target. Ronald is saying that target is not ambitious enough. He's looking at 90 billion. So it would be interesting to hear some of those reactions just from the conversations that we started off with. So I'll go one last round. So maybe starting with Victor, is there a mismatch between what small and growing businesses need and the interventions that are in place, both from your experience and the conversations that you've had today? And very briefly, because we don't have much time left, and then Florence, maybe just talk about the barriers and some of the challenges that you may be facing as you tackle some of this very, very, very important and exciting interventions around business reforms. And then Sheena, I think you made a very good point about this public-private engagement. How can we enhance that? How can we continue to engage to support business reform efforts? And then lastly, Bernard and Ronald, what kind of actions are you seeing from different actors in the ecosystem to support these initiatives? And also enhance accountability from policymakers, right? So we always talk about all these good things, but how do you just ensure that people are accountable? And I think Ronald made some good points around tracking, but how do we ensure that we check each other and we ensure that these things are actually happening? So I'll let you go, Victor. And then Florence, you can come in, and finally Bernard and Ronald. And once we're done, I'll try and see if there's any other questions that I've answered, but I'll also encourage you to just go into the chat and quickly respond to some of those questions. Victor, very, very quickly, we don't have much time.
Yeah, so two policy weaknesses that we've been able to observe based on our own research. Number one is the lack of updated data around SMEs and startups. So the question we always ask whenever we see an intervention by government through stimulus economic program, etc., is what data is driving, is underpinning your intervention? And of course, with outdated data, we currently have 2016 as the last year where we did mass data collection around SMEs. So what is informing the kind of interventions that is there? So we lack up-to-date data and a systematic data collection mechanism that is able to inform policy intervention. That's a weakness we've seen in terms of policy. The second one, I think, which also Ronald had alluded, is a lack of a comprehensive evaluation. If you look at Vision 2030, MTP1, MTP2, up to 3, and if you look at vis-a-vis budget making processes in terms of what is articulated in budget in subsequent budget policy statements, we always see is almost like we are starting new strategies every year without a proper evaluation of what actually happened to the strategies that were raised last year. Was there sufficient financing? Supplementary budgets were passed. What happens there? So with that, then it means that we can't be able to really sufficiently address some of the challenges that SMEs face as well as different other sectors. Of course, due to the interest of time, I would just stop there.
Thank you. Florence, challenges as we segue into the end, and what more could we be doing? What are the barriers? Because I think that's really the core of the question here. What are some of the barriers that you see in terms of really continuing and delivering on some of the good work that you're doing?
Thank you, Rosemary. I think one of the main challenges we face is, how to get to the actual beneficiaries and get them in this very participatory approach to be able to voice some of the challenges they face. So we will find that in social media, people talk a lot, this is a challenge I'm facing. But when you try and have an organized way of getting feedback from private sector, either through very formalized frameworks like associations and so on, that feedback doesn't come back to be able, because government needs to engage in a structured way, get the proposals from private sector. So I'd encourage a lot of businesses to be part of associations that are able to actively air their challenges, either through KEPSA or Chamber, or to form organizations or associations or business member organizations that can actively engage government. We struggle with getting that feedback, but we do see a lot in social media and complaints, but I don't think that's a very effective way of addressing the challenges that are being faced by these businesses. I think a more organized approach, because we are ready and willing to receive these submissions and memoranda from private sector, I think that would be a key way to making sure that we are heard. The other challenge is, of course, the resistance of change. The work we do is across government. So we are mandated to work across various ministries in the government and agencies as well. Changing the mindset of public service delivery, it does not happen very quickly. So patience will have to be sought, and in terms of seeing that change on how the people will actually deliver the services. We will automate, we will change the law, but at the end of the day, the front-facing staff and people who are involved would really have to change their mindset in terms of their role in ensuring that the public does get service in the most efficient way. Yeah, so I guess those are the two big ones, but there are many other small ones, but we will solve them in bits. Yeah.
Thank you so
Rosemary.
much. Thanks so much, Florence. And as Sheena and Bernard come in, there's a question there from, I think, Kathy. I can see Florence had answered most of that on the role of philanthropy. If you'd like to take that in the chat box, Ronald, or any of the panelists, please do directly in the chat. And also from Eric, I think also asking us the role of philanthropy, public-private partnerships. So Sheena, this engagements, maybe kind of just help us kind of, crystallize this thinking around partnership and how you see things moving forward and the role for different actors.
Yeah, thanks. And I think I can actually answer Kathy's question as part of this, because I was going to touch onto it. I think the first point I would say is, let's be very intentional about collaboration. Everybody talks about collaboration, but collaboration is very difficult, because what underpins collaboration is competition. At the end of the day, we're all competing, whether it's competing for resources like finance, whether it's competing for media like attention, whether it's competing for, as a different country, to be seen to be what you're doing. Everybody has a certain element of competition. So let's be mindful for that. I think it's very naive to think that people are not competing. We are. But within that competition, if we can then identify the areas of where we can collaborate, that's where we'll see wins, because they are win-wins. And that's what we have to focus on. Acknowledge where we're competing, and then focus on where we can collaborate. And that works with all the different kind of players. And I think there then comes the role of the different businesses, whether you're a Kenyan government, foreign government, an SME association, etc. We have to understand each party or each, they have their own agendas, and that's fine. That's how organizations work. But where can the organization's agenda meet each other's interests? And this is where the role of philanthropy, I think, comes in. One of the problems, I think, is a lot of the times, although anytime anybody's writing a check is always going to be seen favorably, the problem is that power of writing a check should not mean that you should be able to influence government or policy, etc. I think we need to be very, very careful around, that kind of money, whether you're a foreign government or a philanthropist, etc. I think what our role should be then is understanding, right, what is the government's agenda? Does that fit in with what businesses, social enterprises, picking on the social enterprise point, does that fit in with the country's agenda? And let's bring together the different views. So it's not just the loudest or the most biggest voice that's heard, and bring in those different players. And that's what we should do, is have those different viewpoints and get those out there. And secondly, I think is we need to break our egos to say, well, I did this, or the UK government did this, or the Kenyan government, Ministry of ICT did this, or this ministry did this, or this, philanthropic organization did this, and actually think about, well, what is the best practices, or what's good for the country, and then make noise about it. So if a ministry has done something that's got nothing to do with me, as part of my role, I should make sure that that work is shared with communities at large, so that they can understand what it is. Same thing is if a smaller community that's not in Nairobi, remember Kenya is not Nairobi, Nairobi is not Kenya, has an idea that needs to be brought to the public at large. I think that's the role that we need to do, is make it fair and make everybody's voice being heard and share. But I think collaboration is key, be intentional, but remember we are also competing. And if we don't think you are, then we are lying to ourselves.
Thank you so much, Sheena. Collaboration. And then more so being intentional about it, but also being aware of the different interests. It doesn't mean that because interests are divergent and there's competition, we can't collaborate. Thank you so much. So I'd like to bring in maybe perhaps so that Bernard can conclude for us. Ronald, you can come in if you have anything to just say on top of that. And then maybe Bernard can help us wrap it up.
Thanks, Rosemary, and thanks all other speakers. I think I completely agree with Sheena's last point, and just to re-emphasize that I think, and I alluded to this earlier, I think sometimes the ecosystem can be extremely vicious to each other, because obviously we are in a competitive landscape, but we have to appreciate that we win together. Or we sink together. From a TBI perspective, we continue to emphasize the need to support leaders. And again, sometimes we can be a bit harsh on our leaders, not appreciating the complexities of managing the regulatory environment. But TBI is here obviously to support. We will continue to do that. And finally, to say, I think the opportunities have now gone beyond our borders. We are still largely talking about creating opportunities for if it is Kenyan entrepreneurs within the Kenyan borders, and forgetting that the conversation has fundamentally shifted with the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And we're now not just talking about a 40 million people market, but a 1 billion people market. And therefore we need to broaden our thinking and start having more Pan-Africa facing conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. I couldn't have put it better myself. Bernard.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think, thank you, Rosemary, and thank you, colleagues. That has been an intriguing conversation. All of us understand the role that SMEs play in our economies. And something that in any conversation that we won't miss is about, and Victor started with that, is about the GDP. And it's true, nobody eats GDP. Growth must be visible. Growth must be felt. We can talk, we can say how GDPs are growing because of what we are doing with SMEs. But if it's not felt, if it's not visible, we're doing little. And so to me, from where I sit, we need slightly to move from this term called empowerment and all our initiatives to be investments so that we look at the returns. And that is why I'll challenge Ronnie to be able to increase their wallets so that we strengthen government structures across our continent so that we have effective oversights. Florence, to be able to expand the public engagement opportunities so that we ensure that we are increasing mandate and improving the quality of reforms and the quality of audits and the quality of reforms that we have, and that all of us can be able to strengthen the private sector infrastructure that is needed to actualize this. And so as the bank, as even we go to our next 10-year operational framework from 2022 to 2032, and towards what we all say Africa we want, Africa 2063, we just must remain deliberate and have coordinated interventions to pull to what we want Africa to look like. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernard, for those apt remarks and concluding around the underpinning statements for the Africa we want and looking towards 2063. So once again, I'd like you to join me in saying a big thank you to our panelists today. They've done an excellent job. And the one thing I would say as the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs is that this is one of many in a series. We aim to essentially provide a platform within which these conversations can begin to take shape. We've been having conversations and we've also talked about it here, but we're talking to ourselves. We're talking with people who understand our language. We're talking with people who are likely to hear where we're coming from, but we're not talking together and we're not working together. So that is what we aim to do over the next couple of years, thinking about working obviously with organizations such as the AU, national governments, local governments, regional governments, organizations such as Ronald's, and really harnessing our collective convening powers in order to ensure that this continues. So once again, thank you so much. And stay tuned. I would encourage you to sign up, as Maureen has put in the chat, for some of the other sessions within SunCalp, and look out for information on the next series of convenings we'll be having around this very important topic. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. And thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Yeah, and bye.
Thank you, bye-bye.